So this is the first of the 8 Grand Panelists meeting, which is organized by, the DEFO program in, I don't know, Doctor Training Center. Does anyone know what that is? But this DEFO program. And it aims to discuss a range of interesting, varied, and global issues. And in this particular one, we're going to be talking about how climate science and policy making should come together and what's the best way forward to implement climate change solutions. Right, so from right to left, because we'll start with our chair, these are our panelists. Professor Nick I, who's right here, he researches energy and he's done a lot of work in the policy area. Obviously, they'll introduce themselves further later on, but I'll give a brief run through. Fiona, she writes for The Guardian and she covers all the environmental issues, very experienced writer. And then we have Rachel, who I believe is a cabinet member of some sort, and you work in climate change solutions as well. And then we have Simon, who's here. He's a popular popular YouTuber, lots and lots of followers, and he covers all sorts of climate science issues and general science things. So with that said, let's welcome our panelists, and I'll hand over to Nick, who will be chairing the panel discussion.
Thank you for doing the first bit of my job for me. Just going to start by asking the 3 panelists, and I may chip in afterwards, to say a bit about themselves and what their experience is of communicating between science and policy. And we're talking about, the title is Climate Crisis, Bridging the Gap Between Science and Policy. Is there a gap between science and policy? If so, what's your experience of it and doing something about it? The simplicity, I'm going to go this way, so I'll start with you, Fiona.
Thank you very much. That's a lovely introduction, and thank you very much for holding this today. It's wonderful to be here, and it's a fantastic subject. So I'm Fiona Harvey. I'm the environment editor of The Guardian, and I have been writing about the climate crisis and all environmental issues for almost 19 years. And the big difference that I've seen in that time is that when I started, we were writing about the climate crisis as something in the future, as something that would, befall us at some distant point. And it was very hard then to communicate that to people, to communicate that sense of urgency. When you're talking about, disaster striking in 2050, and it's 2004, people kind of go, oh, they don't really take it seriously enough. Now here we are, it's 2023, and we are seeing the impacts of the climate crisis all around us. We are seeing them now much sooner than scientists were telling us 20 years ago. We are seeing them more stark, more powerful in their impact than scientists were fearing 20 years ago. And we are seeing something that is really before our eyes and undeniable. And the kinds of things which we are now seeing are intensely scary. I was writing just earlier this week about the extraordinary rise in ocean temperatures that we've seen. I had scientists telling me, we're in uncharted territory now. This is off the scale, off the charts, because the oceans, of course, have been repositories for all of the extra energy we've been putting into the atmosphere. Now they're heating up to a record extent in a way that's unprecedented in our records, in a way no scientists ever seen before. So really, in that sense, communicating the climate crisis has become somewhat easier when you can actually see it. But of course, that's the most terrible thing about it, because it's overtaking us now. We are really at least on the verge of tipping points, if not surpassing them. And the fear now is that, people are paying attention at last. But is it too late?
Okay, thank you. I'll leave that question hanging, move on to Rachel. So Rachel, as was said, I'll tell people what you're a cabinet member of. You're the cabinet member with responsibility for climate change at Cotswold District Council. Rachel's also a doctoral student studying climate change communications and engagement at the University of Lancaster. So, Rachel, over to you.
Yeah, so that's so I wear 3 hats most of the time, which is quite exhausting. I am climate change and forward planning cabinet member for Cotswold District Council, which is something I got into purely because of my own concerns about climate change. I'm not terribly interested in politics, but it's that sort of why is this not being dealt with where I live was my main reason for wanting to get involved, and a nerdy desire to get hold of the local plan and change the standards on how things get built where I live. I also am supposed to be doing a full-time PhD looking at ideologies, how people's worldviews and ideologies underpin their attitudes to climate change and climate policy, and how climate policy plays out, especially in rural areas where some of the physical changes will be potentially more impactful. And then also my third role is that I run a small consultancy providing support and advice to other local councils to help them really target and impact their work better. And that, I think, is important in terms of this link with climate communication. Again, like with Fiona, I've been working in this field for around 17 or 18 years. And what I consistently come across are these constant problems that we see around issues like what you might hear called whataboutism, where once we start saying, you know, the UK needs to do X, Y, and Z, and we need to reduce our emissions because of this, that, and the other, and then, oh, but what about China? But what about this? But what about the rich people? And this kind of sense of everybody not quite understanding how all the pieces of this puzzle fit together, and how sometimes what we need is leadership, even though your emissions may not be the highest compared to another country, but you've got the ability to sort of lead the way and communicate how you're doing that so that others can follow. So that kind of whataboutism paralysis is something that I see a lot. I also see those issues around how policymakers and people in charge are often incapable of communicating clearly about climate science, and most importantly about what are the most impactful actions that people and organizations can be taken. So a huge amount of muddying the water happens around communicating local environmental issues. Let's do a litter pick because that will help us tackle climate change. Let's recycle these plastic bottles because that will help us tackle climate change. And this sense that, great, I've done a thing, I can tick a box, I've had some environmental action, I can have a photo opportunity, and no sense at all about where the really impactful actions might be around insulating lofts, getting people out of Range Rovers and all that kind of thing. So a real dearth of basic grasp of not climate science at a global sense, not about, you know, which ice caps are melting and how much sea ice will be in the Arctic Ocean this year, not that sense, because I don't think it's required of people to know that in any detail, but people understanding their own footprint, their own impact and their organizational footprint is where the massive gulf in communication, to my mind, still needs to be filled.
Finally, Simon. So Simon, as he said, is a YouTuber. He didn't say that he's it wasn't said that he is actually got a background in atmospheric physics, doctorate in atmospheric physics from the University of Exeter, having got his first degree here. So well capable of handling both communications and science.
Yeah, hi. I'm a recovering academic. I suppose I sit at the interface between climate research, scientific research, and public communication. We were talking, I suppose, about 3 entities. We're talking about public, research, and policy. And I very much am on that specific interface. I will leave the more interesting questions, I actually think, to the other panel members. But yeah, in my experience, I've been doing full-time science communication in multiple media for 5 or 6 years now, since I finished the PhD. And I suppose what I see as what's not working, the problem at the moment, is the sheer quantity of misinformation and misconceptions in my line of work. And I'm sure that everybody here will have heard the misconceptions I'm talking about, which are more CO2 is good, actually. The NASA are changing the data to fit a global agenda, that it's all an unfounded hypothesis, all these kinds of things. There have been certain deliberate and it's some unintentional, I think, misinformation campaigns that have been very, very effective at preventing any kind of sort of public consensus and therefore public action on climate. And that's what interests me in doing this. It's something I left research because I felt that this was the best use of my time to do YouTube videos, but also live streams and podcasts, and I wrote a book. I like talking about the atmosphere and talking about how we talk about the atmosphere, basically.
Thanks very much. So just add a few thoughts from my own perspective. I've worked on climate issues for about 35 years now. I was at the front end of people asked by the UK government to work on climate change when Margaret Thatcher was still Prime Minister, actually. So that is going back a bit. And the reason Margaret Thatcher took an interest actually is that she was a scientist.
She's the only UK Prime Minister that had a science degree.
Yeah. So she actually did. I can't say I agreed with Margaret Thatcher on very much. In fact, I disagree with her on almost everything, but she did actually recognise that there was an issue there. And I think in the last 35 years, my perception is that the science to policy interface in this area has improved. I mean, one would hope so, because at that stage, literally, politicians knew nothing about the problem. And it's worth recalling that. And that actually, if you go and talk to the professional policymakers in government departments, the people who are paid out of taxation to think about these issues, they are pretty well informed. Right? There's no sense that they don't know the climate science, that they don't know that the impacts are increasing, that they don't know the key steps that we should be taking. To me, the gap is not so much between ourselves as scientists and that professional group of policymakers. It's between scientists and the broader political process. So senior politicians, some of the things that both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss said about action on climate change were evidence-free. The idea that we could do it without changing lifestyles, for example. There's no evidence to support that. They just thought it was a convenient thing that they wanted to say. And of course, they are aided and abetted by people who deliberately falsify the science. Some of those paid by right-wing think tanks, notably in the United States, is by far so. Not so bad here, but I guess in the world that Simon operates in, it doesn't really matter which country you're in. They're all they're all mushed together now. But of course, we see that in parts of the media as well. I hope you all read The Guardian, not just because Fiona writes for it, but because it is the best UK paper. But sadly, the quality of some other UK newspapers is dubious, and they have a tendency, to lie about climate change, actually. So I do quite a lot of work with journalists trying to communicate the results of our research programs. I am very, very cautious about talking to people from the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, and some others, simply because I know that they will misquote me. So I actually write it down and send them stuff rather than talk to them off the record, because I don't want. I had a journalist the other day was deliberately trying to get me to say that electric vehicles were a bad idea. That was very clearly the agenda. Whereas what our research had said is that electric vehicles can't solve every problem, right? And so that sort of high politics is going on, and I think that's a gap that I don't know how to solve. Maybe we can make some progress on it in the course of the afternoon. So I've got a few prepared questions. At some point, I'm going to bring you all in to ask questions. So be thinking of questions that you want to ask this eminent group of people, because I think it will work better that way. But I'm just going to start by asking the three of you, where are we on climate policy, particularly in the UK? I know this is an international audience, but we've got people with expertise in the UK. How good is it? How bad is it? Fiona?
It's pretty dreadful, actually. We are way off track on climate policy in the UK on pretty much every metric. There's one really good thing, which is offshore wind. And if you ask the government, which I did earlier this week, because we got some figures from the House of Commons Library showing that investment in the green transition in the UK has fallen quite substantially since 2016 what could have happened then. That's in stark contrast to other economies such as the EU and the US. When I asked the government, about this this finding, they said, "Oh, we're world leaders in offshore wind." And yeah, the UK is doing really well in offshore wind. There are lots of offshore wind farms. There's a move to have even more offshore wind in the North Sea. These are really good things, but I'm afraid that we cannot solve the climate crisis just by the UK doing a bit more offshore wind. There needs to be an awful lot more than that, and on every other measure, the government is failing. And it's not just me saying that. The Committee on Climate Change, which are the government's statutory advisors set up under the Climate Change Act of 2008, they're an independent body, and they look at how the UK is doing, and they are really concerned. They say that we're just not doing nearly enough on policy. If you look at onshore wind, for instance, the ban on onshore wind in England is still pretty much in place, despite the government saying they would lift it. Similarly, with solar farms, very difficult to get solar farms built. We are completely failing even to put solar panels on new houses and new buildings. The government has explicitly said that they won't mandate that. The government is floating ideas like having hydrogen for home heating, even though study after study after study shows us that hydrogen is not the answer to home heating. It's too expensive and too difficult. We need heat pumps instead, but we're not installing heat pumps. If you look at transport, transport is absolutely woeful. The greenhouse gas emissions from transport are really not budging. And that's because even though we are using more electric cars, despite what Daily Mail journalists will say, the use of electric cars is completely outweighed by the fact that so many people are piling into SUVs, which they are being explicitly encouraged to do by vehicle manufacturers, and that's been assisted by the tax system. We're not doing anything much on public transport to get people out of their cars altogether, and a lot of people went back into their cars after COVID. So transport is just a disaster area. On homes, a huge chunk is 14% of our emissions come from heating our homes, and yet we're not insulating houses. We don't have a scheme in this country to encourage most people to insulate their houses. We're not helping people to insulate their houses. Meanwhile, we are expanding oil and gas in the North Sea. The government is very, very likely to give the green light to a big new development in the North Sea called Rosebank, which would be 3 times bigger than the Campbell oil field, which people were protesting against last year. That's almost certain to get a green light now. Well, what kind of message does that send? Similarly, we've got a new coal mine in Cumbria that the government wants to go ahead. Okay, the emissions from that will not be enormous, but they're completely unnecessary. We don't need a new coal mine at this point. So although there are ways in which the UK is moving ahead, there are so many ways in which we are failing so badly that really the report card is very grim.
Thank you. That was pretty comprehensive. I'm going to ask the other two of you to add anything you want, starting with you, Rachel. But Rachel, you might want to say a bit more about action at lower scale, at more local scale.
I think
maybe a bit of a more hopeful story in some places.
Just to touch on a couple of things Fiona said, that I think one of the biggest issues is that this government, this country has sort of rested on the laurels of having the Climate Change Act. There's a lot of bragging and boasting about being the first country to self-legislate. The Climate Change Act effectively originally said we needed to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050, and then it was strengthened to be net zero by 2050, and that established the Committee on Climate Change to kind of, from the sidelines, independently adjudicate whether or not we're achieving that. So that's all great. We've got this pledge, we've got this target, we've got this kind of framework that we're supposed to work within. But where policy entirely falls down is that there is no owner for that. So technically, BEIS or DESNES or whatever that department is now called, they are like the bean counters for the Climate Change Act. They work out and work with the Climate Change Committee whether or not we're meeting those targets, but they have no power to compel any other departments to do something. So most crucially, we have DLUC, the Department for Levelling Up Homes and Communities, who are the owners of the planning system. The planning system determines what gets built, how it gets built, to what standards it gets built, and where it can be built. And where it can be built is important, because if things can be built in places that are not accessible, then you are automatically baking in car-dependent communities. And it is my personal experience of working with DLUC and their predecessor CLG over the last 15 years that at a ministerial level and at senior civil service level, there is a lack of commitment to the climate agenda, a complete lack of understanding actually among a lot of the senior staff about how important it is, and a lack of grasp about how important the planning system is in delivering that. And then that all feeds through with, you know, you've got the Department for Transport, who I think has had a lot more ministerial steer. Similarly, stuff plays out in DEFRA. So we've got this kind of completely emasculated department within BEIS or DESNES or whatever they're called, who are supposed to somehow make the Climate Change Act add up, but have zero power to do so. And nowhere was that more dangerous than when we had a coalition and we had Ed Davey and what was DEC then, with a different name, arguing with Eric Pickles in what was CLG then. You know, this was basically two ministers having a scrap about whether or not one of them could stand on the other one's lawn, you know, so this is what it comes down to. So what we really need is something like a net zero delivery body, which sits above all of that and ultimately probably takes its steer from the Treasury, and that someone in the Treasury actually believes that this really needs to happen. They need to be responsible, and then they need to tell everyone else. And that does have a massive impact at local government. You go out, you vote every 4 years, some of you will be voting next week probably for councillors, and you'll be wondering why they can't even do basic things like ask for solar panels to be put on new houses. That's because the National Planning Policy Framework does not allow us to do that. And what that means is that every time the government, we try and write our local plans, and then the government keeps changing the goalposts. We've had 4 attempts at planning reform in the last 3 years, all of which have been stopped. The whole thing, we've had 4 ministers. We've got another one now, consultation that was meant to close on the 25th of March. They were meant to give the answer, sorry. They've now decided that they probably won't come back on that for a year. So we're just there in limbo, trying to write a plan with no guidance, even on basic things like how many houses do you want us to build? So we've got the most centralized in Europe, I think, policy position. Local government is completely weakened. We've lost nearly 40% of our funding in 10 years. We have very, very limited powers compared to most other municipal governments in other European countries. And we're trying to deliver what we do on a shoestring. So what we actually need in this country is a duty. There needs to be a duty placed upon local authorities, a statutory duty that requires us to plan a zero carbon trajectory for our place, that requires us to report back up to a national net zero delivery body or something like that. Because without that, it will be down to the infighting of local politicians. It will be down to whether you've got a Conservative-led council or a Lib Dem-led council or a coalition full of infighting or whatever. And we cannot have that mosaic, that patchwork, that piecemeal approach. Every council, regardless of political colour, needs to be statutorily bound to deliver on this. And to give you the most absurd example of all, right now we have a statutory duty to protect and conserve heritage, but we do not have a statutory duty to reduce carbon emissions. And what that means is we end up with absurd situations like Wokingham Borough Council, where the council owns a library that the council wants to put solar on, and the council applied to the council for permission to put solar on the council's library, and the council said no. That's where we're at.
That's a wonderful story, and I could add a similar story about the building I work in South Parks Road, which the City Council would have been very happy to see renovated to a high standard. Has been improved, but because it's things could not be done. Because heritage trumps planetary survival.
It's like Planet of the Apes. We'll be seeing Wokingham Library on a beach, and we'll be like, no.
Simon, what do you want to add?
I mean, as I say,
from your perspective as somebody who thinks about communicating with the general public as opposed to policy.
I mean, I'd actually, the thing I wanted to add was from a purely physical science perspective, because one of my supervisors in PhD had a very simple phrase. He said the climate crisis, the solution is actually very simple. Keep the carbon in the fucking ground. And on that level, any government that is proposing to expand the extraction of fossil fuels rather than contract it is failing on climate policy. So from a very simplistic perspective, from a physical scientist perspective, that was how I would grade this government.
Okay. Physicists, we have a great simple way of looking at
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we're in a situation where you're all painting a pretty poor picture of our progress. I would say that our understanding of the problem, the evidence about the problem, is much better than it's ever been before. And whether that's about the physical science of the atmosphere and the oceans, whether it's about the impacts on ecosystems, on food, on water, whether it's about what the solutions are in terms of where we can get reductions in carbon emissions. This is an odd mismatch, isn't it? I mean, is it, are those of us who are doing, or researchers, not being clear enough? What's the problem? Why have we got ourselves into this? Into this part? I'm going to go the other way around.
Sure.
Start with you.
Yeah, it's not a scientific problem. And it hasn't been, you could argue, for 2 or 3 decades. We have had overwhelming evidence that we know what the problem is, we know what our role is, and in broad strokes, what the solutions are. The solutions are not a scientific problem. They are largely political and sociological, and in some cases, engineering based. So there is sort of an element of scientific challenge in there. But the problem is not how scientists are speaking to policymakers or the public, I think, about the problem. It's perhaps more how we're talking about the solutions. And I think if I was to isolate one thing that scientists are doing very poorly, it is not being specific enough. I think scientists are very good because as a scientist, you're trained to love uncertainty. A figure is not a proper figure unless you have an error bar on it. And unfortunately, people who are not scientists, like economists and politicians, don't quite understand what that means. And so when you say this is the solution that we're proposing within this error range, I think a lot of people hear that and go, well, you don't know what the solution is. Or you're not proposing this specific technology is what we should be using. I think that that mismatch in language is perhaps where our problems lie when it comes to solutions.
Okay, thanks. Rachel.
Yeah, I agree. It's not a technical problem in that sense. It's a sort of socio-political problem. One of the things that I think is a real barrier to progress actually is how some of what we need to do has been captured and repackaged. There are other revolutions hidden in the message. And this is linked to the work that I'm doing on my PhD around how people on the right and people on the left don't necessarily see this problem as being the same. They don't necessarily see it as having the same causes. So you might ask somebody who has a very left-leaning worldview, and they might subscribe to a whole wider set of issues around runaway capitalism, around the abuse of capital, around class-based struggles, around all that kind of thing. They might use phrases like intersectionality and privilege, and they might talk about how when we tackle this problem, we will be simultaneously kind of unpicking the pillars that hold up Western capitalist society. But if you're of a different worldview and you're actually all right with Western capitalist society, and you think that maybe it's been a bit hammered and it's not quite as bad as all that, then what you see is climate change as a plot to undermine your way of life. And you are being sold a load of solutions that have words like justice all over them. You think, what does justice mean? Is that the same as fairness? Actually, to me, they probably mean the same thing, but to some people, they really don't. And so I think we've ended up with this sort of capture, I suppose, in really crude terms, by the left of the climate crisis as a weapon to deliver a revolution. And what that's doing is making a lot of other people digging their heels and be suspicious of every single proposal to solve the problem. And that, again, to give a live example, if you live in or you're familiar with Oxford, you'll know about all the fuss that arose with the low traffic neighbourhoods. the 15-minute city. I mean, I've worked in planning for years. 15-minute city is a phrase that's been around forever. 15-minute city means I'd like to walk my kids to school. I'd like to go to the dentist without getting in my car. I'd like to be able to go and buy a pint of milk on foot. It's really not a very challenging concept to get your head around. It's extraordinary how that was quickly captured and turned into, we will literally be locked into a 15-minute zone and never allowed to leave, and we'll have to have a permit to meet our granny, and crazy stuff like that. But if you think somebody is trying to weaponize climate change to achieve something, then you will be easily led down the line of believing that sort of narrative about what is bog standard urban planning practice. So I think that in a way, what scientists have not been great at is recognizing necessarily, and I think actually what you find is quite a lot of academics are in that world and they're using that language as well, and not recognizing how it doesn't land and can actually seem quite threatening to some other people who are not evil people. They're just people who view the world differently. And, you know, all ideology is normative, right? It's just how you want the world to be. It's not fact. So I just think that that's a really big part of the problem. And also, I think, just to add to that, another issue with the sort of technical approach is that sometimes there is too much. I think it's absolutely right that we look at these problems and we say, okay, we've got this problem. Let's take the problem of decarbonising UK heating. What is the least cost way to society of decarbonising UK heating? Is it to put individual heat pumps in everyone's houses? Let's avoid hydrogen. Or is it to put district heating networks everywhere? Well, it's probably the latter. If you literally could dig up every road and do it that way, it's probably let's have as many district heating systems as we can and then just fill in the gaps with individual air source heat pumps. But realistically, what actually has to happen in society for all those district heating systems to be built is any number of conversations with landlords, with landowners, with missing landowners, with ransom strips of land, with this, that, and the other. And it literally won't happen. And yet there will be people with fellowships and enormous 5-year grants busily modelling district heating for the entire country. And realistically, that won't happen. So I think often we let on a screen perfect be the enemy of good when we're working on this from a purely technical point of view.
Just to build on something you said, I think this is all deeply connected with this idea of conspiracy ideation. The same people who are opposed to climate action, so view this as a threat to their way of life, are also the same people, certainly in my line of work, that you will see be anti-vaccine, who will be Trump won the election, the conspiracy, the diagram is basically, the Venn diagram is basically a circle for a lot of these people. And I think the reason for those other conspiracies to be so popular and to spread, particularly online so quickly, is basically disenfranchisement. It's people who feel politically disenfranchised and economically disenfranchised. And I think you could argue that when it comes to climate, people feel scientifically disenfranchised. They feel like they don't have a voice in this discussion. And also they don't understand the data, they don't understand the papers that these things are based on, because we have a scientific literacy problem in our society. And I think if COVID showed anything, it was that we have a statistical literacy problem. If you want to do anything, I think, to improve how the public engages with this as an issue, you've really got to get back to basics in terms of scientific and statistical education.
Yeah.
Well, the reason why we have a climate crisis, and the reason why we continue to have a climate crisis, despite 30 years of science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change telling us that we have a climate crisis, the reason is because some people are making a great deal of money out of it. And we've seen that in the last year. We had the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, and oil and gas prices shot up. They were going up anyway because of COVID, the recovery from the pandemic, but they started soaring, and the profits of oil and gas companies went absolutely through the roof. And they've been making record profits, billions upon billions of pounds, more money than they know what to do with, in the words of the chief financial officer of BP. And that's just shows how completely wrong our economic system is, that we are allowing that to happen at the expense of all of our futures. So the shareholders in a handful of large companies are making enormous quantities of money at the expense of everyone else on the planet. And that's the key problem here. These are very powerful vested interests. It's not just the oil and gas companies, the people who are selling us SUVs, the people who benefit from the kind of current economic system, the people who are running enormous intensive mega farms, who are ranching in the Amazon, who are building palm oil plantations in Southeast Asia, and so on. There are these vested interests that are deeply embedded in the economy. And so the way around that, well, there are several ways around that. The economically elegant way around that is to put a price on carbon dioxide. Well, I've been writing for 20 years about a price on carbon dioxide, and I'm here to tell you it's never going to happen. So just give that one up. It's economically beautiful. It's theoretically gorgeous. And it's just got the aerodynamics of a flying pig. So we need to find solutions that actually work. We need to find ways to cauterize these vested interests, to bring them into line with the interests of all of the people on the planet, rather than just, their desire to make more money while they can.
Thanks. So I buy your analysis. I'm a Guardian reader. It's perhaps not surprising. I buy that analysis. How do we take forward that agenda without falling into what I think is the trap that Rachel pointed out, that it can sound awfully like trying to solve a bunch of other issues instead of trying to solve climate change to many people in what's loosely known as Middle England.
Yeah, that's a real problem, and you put your finger on a massive problem there. I've been trying to tell people for 20 years that it's really essential that the climate crisis does not become a left-right issue. Because once something becomes a left-right issue, then people just fall into their entrenched attitudes, and that's it. You can't persuade people out of that. The climate crisis is a physical and chemical problem, and physics and chemistry don't listen to politicians, and they don't have a left and a right. There's no left-wing physics and right-wing physics.
Should read my comments.
But we've got to get to grips with the immutable laws of this planet, rather than the entirely mutable laws of economics and politics. I think that the sort of silver lining to the awfulness of the climate crisis that we're in is that I think some people are realizing that, yes, we have to transcend these entrenched attitudes, and that that the climate crisis is so great that it has to unite everyone. But there's another problem here, and I don't actually have a solution to it at the moment, which is that the UK is one country and it's a democracy. So we're able to sit here and have this discussion, and we're all able to go home and if we have our ID, we can vote next week and so on. So that's really good, because there are fewer and fewer countries in the world where that's a possibility. And an awful lot of the greenhouse gas emissions around the world are coming from non-democracies. China is an obvious example. I would class India as increasingly no longer a democracy in any real sense. Most of the oil-producing countries, the countries in the Middle East, they're not democracies, and their oil companies are mostly nationally owned. Look at Russia, with its massive greenhouse gas emissions and its oil and gas exports. We can have a debate over whether the United States is a functioning democracy, another massive emitter. But it's very, very hard in countries that are not democracies to even raise this issue, let alone to actually get to a point where anyone in government is going to solve it. So Yeah, I'm sorry. I know that I'm supposed to be here trying to come up with some answers. I don't have an answer to that. How
That's
do you solve
a
the
category of answer, actually.
There is something I could add to that, I suppose, which is, and I think this is quite a Chomskyan idea, but even in our democratic system, in America's democratic system, the policy that is on offer is not something that's determined by science per se. It's something that's determined by the public. Politicians will only put up policy that they think is going to get them elected. And you could argue this also applies to undemocratic countries, I suppose. The flow of information needs to go from science to public and from public to policy.
Yeah.
And so the key thing is keeping the public engaged with the science and getting scientists better at talking about it and talking, as we said before, about specific solutions. And it's something that I think we had a lot of doom and gloom about where the UK specifically is at in terms of climate policy. I think one area that we can be optimistic about is the fact that climate is still on the table. It's something that is continually in the public consciousness, and especially now with the rise of Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion, it's something that is constantly there. And so people are having to come up with a stance on climate policy, and the longer it's there, the more momentum you build, and potentially, in theory, the stronger the solutions that you have on the menu politically that you can then choose to vote for. So it's not a solution, but it's at least a pathway to consider.
Rachel, can I ask you to say a bit about your work on engagement, citizen assemblies, that sort of agenda?
That leads on quite neatly from what Simon was just saying. So my PhD is part of a project at Lancaster University called Climate Citizens, which is being led by Professor Becky Willis, who some of you may know was one of the people involved in setting up Climate Assembly UK a couple of years ago. And the project more widely is looking at other things, but one of the things is around effectively the strapline you might want to say is, if we're going to solve the climate crisis, we need more democracy, not less. And I know that within a lot of local authority climate emergency declarations, the phrase is, we will run a climate assembly, was sort of put in there. And that's partly because a lot of them were carbon copies. They were lifted from other councils and they were just, they were all spat out in very short order. And lots of councils committed to a carbon reduction target and running a climate assembly and all these things without actually having the faintest notion of what they were signing up for. They didn't understand the science. They didn't know if it was possible. And they crap at consultation. The idea that they would go from a totally atrocious ability to do consultation to running a really hardcore deliberative process is quite funny, actually. But there we go. They all signed up for it to stop XR gluing themselves to things. So that was good. But what deliberative democracy processes are, if you're not familiar with them, they're not just used around climate. They've been around for years. They came out of work at Harvard by a guy called James Fishkin in the 80s, called deliberative polling. And the idea is that to avoid that partisan split where people just vote along party lines or ideological lines, if you have a topic that's quite contentious or difficult or emotive or complicated, you bring people together. You bring what you would call a representative group of people from your given population together. They hear from experts. They may even hear from people who are affected by the topic. And this is actually in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, written into their constitution. So, for example, when they wanted to change the laws on abortion in Ireland, they had a national assembly with 110 people involved. Not only did they hear from religious figures who opposed the changes, they heard from women who had gone abroad to have abortions, they heard from medical providers, they heard, from the whole range. And then they came up with some recommendations. And those recommendations are not binding on government. But what we find is that we've had a national assembly, we've had a Scottish assembly, I think there's been a Welsh one now, we've had something like 28 regional or local assemblies on climate in this country. And they all come up with roughly the same set of recommendations. And also what's underpinning it, when you look at, as I have been recently, when you look at actually the transcripts and you see the actual words of what people say, is what they all want are the solutions to be delivered without leaving them with a massive problem. And what underpins a lot of resistance to the policies isn't necessarily that they don't want the policies to happen. It's that they fear that something, with transport, for example, everybody's keen on having loads of buses that come exactly when they say they should, with lighty up signs that tell you if they're late. Everybody's keen on having great cycle routes so kids can cycle to school and blah, and so on and so forth. But what they believe will happen is that we will first stop people using their cars, and then we won't bother to deliver those things. So it's a question of politically at every level, and it's very difficult with local government because there's so little funding, listening to what's coming out of these assemblies, it's almost not worth running any more of them. We've had so many, and they've been spread around England and Scotland and Wales, and they're coming up with very similar policy prescriptions, which is things like, no, new houses should be built that aren't zero carbon. Well, that means change the planning system. Well, we've been talking about that for years, and clearly the people want that. It's about making sure that there is a huge amount of funding injected into public transport. Well, that kind of flies in the face of the anger we've seen in Oxford recently. Maybe that anger is stemming from the fact that people don't believe the money will be there, and so on and so forth. Yeah, or it's about food. It's about housing, existing housing. As Fiona said, we don't have a scheme to insulate houses. People want help. They want advice. They want to know how to do it well, and they want to be able to access grants or at least low interest or interest-free loans to do that. They're keen to do it, but they need to be led to it, and they need to know that that support isn't going to be put there and taken away again 5 weeks later, as it has been. So those deliberative processes, I think, have sanity checked, in a way, policies that we know would fly, we know would work. And it just needs now for government to say, okay, these all seem to be acceptable, they're a way forward. And if you look at the footprint of any given parish or ward or wherever you live, you will find that probably if you're in a rural area, 40% of your emissions are transport related. Another 35% are related to your buildings that you live in. And that if you break it down by kind of socio-demographic status, your wealthy households have 4 times the footprint of your poorest households. So if every council had the ability to heavily invest in public and active travel, provide grants and advice and support locally to insulate everybody's houses, and help rich people, and I know that sounds mental, but they've got the biggest footprints, they've got the most money, they've got the most agency, they own their own homes, they can choose whether they're buying a Range Rover. Let's talk to them. They've got lots going on, they've got big important jobs, they're big important people, that's why they're so rich. So, if we help them make the right decisions, a lot of them are actually keen to do that. And, I'm at the point where I want it to be where, buying a cargo bike is super aspirational, and in Country Homes magazine next week, that's where then suddenly they'll start doing it.
In East Oxford, it is aspirational.
Well, and Oxford's weird though, right?
And just so people know, Oxford did have a citizens' assembly on climate change in 2019. It was a very interesting experience for those involved with it. And what struck me was that the people involved weren't getting bogged down in ideology, that the questions they were asking those who were there to provide information were really basic things like, well, how are electric vehicles going to come down in cost, and how does a heat pump work, and why is solid wall insulation so expensive? Those sorts of questions, really quite day-to-day.
And often also what comes out of all of them is a real sense that people do want to make sure that the poorest in society aren't going to be affected by policy. That thread comes out of most assemblies. There was a really interesting one in Helsinki, just specifically on transport, where actually the people in the assembly came up with an entirely new policy prescription for how EVs in Finland should be subsidized. And it wasn't the huge rates that the government were currently owning. It was a different thing that they felt would spread to the lower segments economically of society, which was just another example of that. If you get ordinary people together in a room, they do tend to look after each other.
Right, we've talked quite a bit about engagement and the need to involve people. We've done it all from the front. We haven't engaged you at all. So let's change that. Anybody got any questions for the panel that they want to raise? Don't be shy. I've got lots of spare ones, so don't worry. But really good to get your involvement. Yes.
There's a phrase you said that kind of stuck with me. The carbon pricing has the aerodynamics of a flying pig or something. I'm just curious if you could elaborate a bit about your experience in what is the biggest source of opposition to these ideas? Is it a public dislike, or they don't want to deal with the complication of sending it out, or what's the problem?
Yeah, so the history of the attempts to put in place a carbon price. Well, let me start by saying that the strongest supporters of a carbon tax have been ExxonMobil. Why did they support a carbon tax? Because they thought it would never happen. because if you tell people you are putting a tax on something that's going to increase their cost of living, then they will be unhappy about that. Also, this is an important point, a carbon tax is regressive because it quite often falls most heavily on people who can least afford it. So, you're seeing that in the UK at the moment, where the price of fuel has gone through the roof. It's the people, who can't afford their electricity bills, who can't afford their heating bills, who are really suffering. The people in their SUVs and so on, they've got higher bills, but they can absorb it. So when you're going to put, if you were going to put a price on carbon, the only way to do it is to have some mechanism that counteracts that, where you can ensure that people who are poor and vulnerable are not being hit by it, and that's actually quite hard to do. A carbon trading system is also quite a nice, an economically elegant way of doing this, and that works to some extent. We've seen that in Europe, but the European emissions trading scheme was horribly flawed when it started in 2005, because they gave away too many free carbon permits. Then the financial crisis in 2008 and 9 completely destroyed it, really, because the carbon price fell through the floor. And it was years, it's taken most of the last decade for the EU emissions trading system to recover and to have any kind of point. So its impact on saving the world from the climate crisis has really been minimal. If we're going to actually solve the climate crisis, then as we've just heard, keep it in the ground. That's not really going to be done by just by an economic measure. When Nicholas Stern wrote the Stern Review in 2006, he said that there's a range of tools at our disposal. There are economic measures like taxes and trading systems and carbon pricing, but there's also regulation. And really, I think that we need to move more to regulation and to actually start taking the money off these companies who have made a great deal from selling fossil fuels and selling high carbon goods and services, take the money off them and either force them to put it into low carbon efforts, or give it to someone else who will put it into building a genuinely green economy. And if the government were to do that, I think it could have a big impact. And to regulate so that you're simply not allowed to emit carbon dioxide at the rate we are. We've seen signs of that. The government here has mandated that there'll be no new petrol or diesel vehicles sold in this country after 2030. Now, that's nothing to do with taxes or pricing or anything like that. That's a lovely, straightforward piece of regulation. Now, there are lots of people who are very unhappy about it, and I'm sure that they'll continue to get more unhappy in the Daily Mail between now and 2030. But sensible car manufacturers are now working towards that, and that's a really nice, clear piece of legislation. So if you could have more of that, more regulation like that, then we wouldn't need to rely on these flawed economic solutions.
I can just supplement that to say that the analysis that research that I've been involved with on how we have reduced carbon emissions in the UK, we have reduced them by 40%, so it's not a trivial contribution. The vast majority of that has been achieved through regulation. So relatively straightforward things like regulating the standards for new houses. They're not good enough, but they're a lot better than they were. Regulating boilers, probably the single most boring and effective piece of legislation, right? Just to say that you couldn't install a boiler that was less than 92% efficient. EU regulation of appliances, EU regulation of cars, and on top of that, where there've been incentives, it's been much more the targeted incentives like feed-in tariffs for wind and solar that have driven these new products into the market. They haven't significantly been driven by carbon pricing. So, and as Fiona says, that the policies that people are looking at now are much more about regulating out polluting equipment, notably internal combustion engines and heating boilers. So I think that probably is the way the future's developing anyway, and a move away from what was really economics 101 thinking of all you need to do is have the same carbon price for everything, and you miraculously solve all the problem, which is nice economics but rubbish politics, basically.
It's worth noting the regulatory approach only works if you have a good interface between business and the science.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't work unless you get businesses on board.
Yeah.
I mean, this was something that we saw with the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol stopping CFC emissions was only put into effect when Reagan backed it, and Reagan only backed it because DuPont realized they could profit off of transferring everything from containing CFCs to an alternative. So with enough of a connection there, but also enough runway, if you like, for businesses, which is why, you may ask, why 2030 for internal combustion engines? Why not sooner? If it was any sooner, you wouldn't get the businesses on board, and so it wouldn't work.
Yeah, and it's another element of public engagement, because a lot of these corporate policies are driven, as Simon said, by self-interest, but that self-interest is with one eye on customer. What customers think, particularly in things, say food supply chains, that those sorts of corporations can be quite sensitive to what customers think, and it's why we're seeing climate activism at the PP. Sorts of we shouldn't necessarily think about engagement of people as solely about what they buy. Of course, it's important that people buy heat pumps, buy electric vehicles rather than polluting alternatives. But at least in democracies, we've all got this potential wider role as well. Who else wants to ask a question? Yes, Elaine.
Mostly directed at I'm just curious, so you mentioned representation of climate change primarily emissions of that's what I love from my interested. I'm curious, how do you see those two narratives being reconciled, and what kind of conversations do we need to be having? Is it just the language that's around it that's the issue, or is it the whole narrative?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of it goes back to business, doesn't it? Because some of the reason that wealthier people's footprint is higher is literally that they buy more and they buy bigger things. And some of it comes down to housing, actually. The bigger your house, particularly if it's detached, it will have a bigger footprint. But a lot of it is when you look at a carbon footprint I worked on a carbon footprint tool called Impact, which does community scale, like parish or village scale footprinting. And you can immediately tell without knowing a place. If you look on Impact, you can say that's a wealthy village. And it will be because of the section that's on it's a consumption-based footprinting tool, and the bit that we did on consumption of goods and services, which is enormous, but also a few other key segments. If you look in the transport bit, you'll have flights at 3 or 4 tons a year, where you'll have other bits at a little village on the edge of Liverpool where literally the whole footprint for a household is 5 tons a year. So I think I'm always really keen to avoid any sort of narrative and conversation that is a blame game. This is all your fault kind of thing. And that's, I don't think you have to avoid talking about justice or fairness. But I think avoiding blame, because I run a lot of training. I run a lot of training for parish councillors, district councillors, ordinary people. And I'm constantly amazed at the level of ignorance there is out there about where people's emissions actually come from. So you've got a lot of households with a really big footprint who'll be sending, Timothy and Marabella off to private school every morning. And when they come home, they will check very carefully that those children have put their things in the recycling bin properly. And that they, whatever, are we going to go and feed the chickens that we have in the backyard because these are our low carbon eggs? And, they've got this belief that they're living a a low carbon life. Not necessarily low carbon isn't a phrase they would use, but they're trying and they want to believe that they're being sustainable. They bought a Range Rover EV, for goodness sake, you know, so it's because actually they're subject to a great deal of marketing. You don't market stuff with people who've got no money. You market stuff with people who are going to buy things. And so very wealthy sectors of society are subjected to a huge amount more marketing than poorer sectors of society who are perhaps subjected to the most evil kind of marketing of all around things like gambling. But so I think it's about those conversations about, often these are people who are, you know, highly qualified, quite well educated, can engage with information, but it's not being presented to them. It's not being made clear to them at all where their impacts lie. And I think it's also, to my mind, going back to, you know, business has to be on board. If you want to be really crude and cynical and capitalist about it, there are lots and lots of business opportunities in marketing low carbon lifestyles to people who care, who feel like they should be doing the right thing and don't even really know what to do. And I don't think that those are the sort of people who would also somehow resist or reject necessarily a justice-based conversation. They are exactly the same sort of people who will be concerned at the level of poverty that there is in society, who probably donate to charities and do all of these other things. I just don't think that there is this enormous cohort of incredibly evil high carbon livers in this country who just want to go about destroying the world. They're just ignorant, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. Does that help?
Just to build off the back of that, something that we actually haven't talked about at all has actually been how we talk about climate issues. Right. And something to get on my soapbox for a minute, something that you see wrong all the time with how we're having this conversation is believing that we're addressing a general audience, that you're addressing absolutely everybody. And the number one rule of communication is you have to be specific. You have to be specific in your intent and who you are aiming for, because there is no such thing as a general audience. Yeah. So if you are trying to reach the highly emitting wealthier areas of society, tailor your messaging, which could mean the topics that you're talking about, but also the format that you are talking about it in.
The channel that you use.
The channel that you're using. If you're using TikTok versus Twitch or Instagram or Facebook or YouTube or whatever it is, each one of those platforms have, and there are sub-platforms within each platform, obviously, but they have a specific audience associated with them that you can use to capitalize on that, to get your message through to that audience. Yeah. And the thing that I see people do all the time when, you know, science students are interested in doing climate communication, maybe there are some of you in the audience, is that I'll do a thing about X, Y, Z. It could be about boilers, or it could be about food emissions. And who are you aiming this at? Oh, everyone. And it's just not the effective way to go about this. You have to be really specific. And so zeroing in on an audience like that is absolutely the way to do it. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
And if you're not familiar with their work, an awesome organisation called Climate Outreach, based in Oxford, worked with the More in Common Foundation to produce a fantastic tool called Britain Talks Climate, which breaks the UK population into 7 segments and very clearly shows that not only do those different segments of society have different attitudes toward climate change and will respond to different messaging, but, you know, it helps us think around what agency do they actually have to act. Because I think a lot of government level stuff is broadcast or one size fits nobody messaging. So it just doesn't land with anyone. And it's actually quite offensive if you're a very low income household who doesn't own the property you live in, doesn't have a car to drive about in, can't make any of the decisions because your landlord won't do X, Y, or Z. Like being told to reduce your carbon footprint or be more environmentally friendly when you can barely afford to turn the heating on anyway is almost a level of offensiveness at that point, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, question.
It was just a question about, like, if there are obviously there's like a diversity of solutions that are on do that choosing which.
I'll start. I mean,
can we repeat the question?
Yeah.
For the online audience, just
so the question is about how do we choose between the diverse options that there are available. And I'll start by saying I don't think it is necessarily choice. That the underpinnings of this problem are that the Industrial Revolution, which started in this country and has spread through much, but not all of the world yet, was based on fossil fuels. And so the use of fossil fuels underpins almost everything. Yeah, but in our homes, in our workplaces, the way we move about, the way food is produced. So if we're going to get to zero, net zero, we have to change all of those. So there's some sense in which these aren't alternative options, that we are going to need to make steel in a way that is decarbonised. We are going to need to travel around in a way that's decarbonised, and you can't, when the target was reduce emissions by half or something, you could trade those off against each other. But once you've got to this, well, we're aiming at zero actually, guys, then there's some trading off you can't do. Now you've got alternatives that you can adopt for, as we've discussed, say for home heating in principle, there's different ways you can address it. So you have got some options there, but I do think there's a bit of a danger about thinking, as Rachel implied, we don't want to leave people with the impression that if they put their recycling out okay on a Wednesday night, we're going to solve the climate problem. We're not.
Yeah, did you want to comment on that?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder whether is some of your question about whether or not you think certain things, like let's say it's onshore wind, are so divisive that can we just dispense with that and not talk about it anymore? Like, do you want to expand a bit on?
Yes, I'm going to phrase it for but it's more a question of, like, for example, with renewable, you could do it in like a central that often
community energy versus whatever. Yeah, okay.
So ways you implement the solutions to become quite conflated with different ideologies. So it's about how
okay, just to repeat that for the take, it's that even within certain solution categories, right, like renewable energy, there are potentially radically different ways of doing them in decentralized or centralized or democratic or undemocratic ways.
Yeah. So the renewable energy one, that's a really good example, because another thing that comes out of a lot of the climate assemblies, but also has been around for a long time, is the idea around community energy. And actually that is a great leveler. I did a lot of work on community energy in a previous role, and I ran the government's urban community energy scheme. And that's a really interesting one, where again, if you sort of use phrase around, you want to join a commune that owns a wind turbine, then there's a whole load of kind of communist imagery that floats around behind you when you say it. But if you say, should we have a village wind turbine? That's a completely different conversation. So I'm really oversensitive to the use of language when we talk about some solutions, because actually distributed renewables is a very appealing idea to a lot of people, and certainly under the Labour government up until 2010, I think the wind industry got to the point where it had to some degree ridden roughshod over the desires of certain local communities, and that had caused the backlash against onshore wind that we are now paying for big time with the ministerial statement that pretty much banned it, getting on for, what is it, 7 years ago or something now, we had that statement. Yeah. So but actually the underpinnings of community-based energy, where we've got the ability to own and preferably sell the energy locally, are extremely appealing across the board politically. And again, going back to that Britain Talks Climate tool that I was talking about from Climate Outreach, you've got segments in there, for example, called the Loyal Nationals, which you might crudely be the sort of people who don't read The Guardian, who are, very, very nationalistic. Very, very nationalistic. They're probably more your Daily Express kind of reader, and very proud of being British, think we can solve our problems ourselves, very mistrustful of elites, whether that's, the government or corporate elites or any people like that. And in many ways, they have nothing in common with another sector called the progressive activists, who very much are subscribers to The Guardian. And, they will be quite left-wing politically in their broader ideologies. But you would find that they would coalesce around ideas like local trades, good skills, local jobs for local people, all that kind of thing. Locally owned energy with the ability to sell and get a discount locally. So it's interesting how you can sell some of those solutions by using the right language to quite polarized audiences. And I think there are a few key places where fake solutions are being proposed, and that is 100% corporate lobbying, and hydrogen heating for domestic uses and private vehicles is definitely one of those. So I think there's always going to be a narrative floating along of which of the nasty corporates is trying it on here. But there are enough very clever people out there who are producing paper upon paper showing that. And I guess it is, again, it's a challenge for science to communicate that when the budgets for talking about hydrogen boilers are so much bigger if you're one of those big companies than they are if you're a university researcher or something. But I don't even think hydrogen's particularly catching on with people. It doesn't seem to me that people are really grasping it as an idea, but there will be others.
Yeah, do you want to add anything?
I think that, I mean, I think that what you said is brilliant and absolutely true. And you should be in charge, actually, because this is because you know, this is really getting to the heart of what's wrong here. I think that we've gone past the point where we had the luxury of kind of saying, "Oh, let's have this, let's have that." We need everything. And you know, for instance, you mentioned nuclear. We just you know, we've got beyond the point where we can say that we don't need nuclear power. I think if you look at what's happening in Germany, where they're closing their nuclear power plants but still using a heck of a lot of coal, that's not great. You know, and if nuclear power plants are needed, then you know, we should just we're going to have them. You know, some years ago, 20 years ago, we had all of these choices before us and we failed to make them. And now we just don't have that luxury of time and choice.
And communicating that is so important. If you looked at a model of a trajectory to get to net zero 20 years ago, it would have had almost no carbon capture in it. And now every model has carbon capture in it. And some of that is imaginary carbon capture that hasn't been invented yet. So that's where we're now at. So, and that is a real challenge for political honesty, that there isn't a smorgasbord of choices left anymore. But also then it comes down to the political reality of making it palatable for people and saying, okay, we're going to do this thing, but it's okay because the point of doing this thing is that we'll have a better place. We'll have more active society where people aren't obese. Well, people will have a better diet. People will live in houses that are not mouldy where little toddlers die. You know, people will live in places where they have access to really good locally produced food, where they have access to energy that belongs to the local community. Not necessarily all of it. There will still be national energy companies and so on. There will be a levelling, you know, access in rural areas to jobs and work and educational opportunities will be improved because public transport will actually exist. You know, so you can sell it as a future. You can sell it as a progressive future. You can also sell it as a nostalgic future, and it goes back to what I was saying about, you know, you find your bunch of backbone conservatives in a village in the Cotswolds that just want things to be how they used to be when we waved Union flags. Well, actually, what they're talking about is when everyone rode around on a bike and there was a butcher, a baker, and a candlestick maker on every high street. And what they want is the progressive future that we used to have. So it's about how politicians package it up rather than making it sound like we've got to make all these horrid choices. It should be about, look at what these lovely outcomes will be. And we did that in the Cotswolds for our local plan consultation. We made a video that we pretended we'd made in 2045 that was talking about the decisions we made in 2023 that got us to where we are in 2045. And we talked about these storms and floods that never happened yet and how we knew we'd have to change as a result. And this is what the Cotswolds is now like. And that was quite challenging for officers to work on because they'd never been asked to do something like that before. But I thought it was quite powerful.
So I'm going to sow a bit of dissension by arguing a bit here, because I don't think nuclear power or carbon capture and storage is needed. And I've been involved in studies that show precisely that.
But what I'm saying is that if you look at any of the CCC's graphs, they'll be in there now and they weren't in there 20 years ago because there were more other options. That's the point that I was making, that we've had to include more and more risky, difficult, contentious, whatever.
And I'm making the point that we don't have to. I mean, carbon capture and storage is done pretty well by a rather ancient technology called trees. We don't need more than that. And why we want to throw billions at nuclear power when wind and solar are cheaper, cleaner, and quicker I really don't know, actually. The aim of this government is to decarbonise the UK power system by 2035. The opposition argues with that by saying it should be done by 2030. If you start planning a new nuclear power station now, it won't be operating in 2035. It probably won't even be operating in 2040, given the way. So I think there are some choices.
You don't want to be in a situation where in 2050 or 2060, you're looking back and saying, well, if only we had said yes to a nuclear power station in 2023. That's the kind of, because we've dithered about new nuclear power stations for 30 years. So, maybe we should just have one.
Well, we've often done the having one and then decided it was too expensive and given up. I think we have. The reason I disagree is that actually there is a finite amount of money to invest, and it makes sense to invest in the things that are most effective in reducing carbon emissions in any one area, like electricity generation. That does not to say we don't also need to act on heating.
Yeah, but you don't want to be in a situation where in 2050 you're looking back and saying, "Oh, isn't it a shame that China stopped the export of solar panels after buying up all of the rare earths in the late 2020s?" You need to have a multiplicity of options there, because we failed to take advantage of the multiplicity of options that were available 20 years ago.
I agree with that, and I've achieved one of my objectives, which is to get a bit of an argument going. Yeah, let's take one online. Just let me warn the panelists, we're getting close to the end. When there's probably 3 minutes to go, I'll ask you all just to make a one minute closing commentary, which brilliantly sums up everything that you've heard.
Yeah, we're happy to so one of our questions from the online audience is from a PhD student in a climate adjacent field, and they are asking, what are the most climate impactful ways to do outreach and communication of research work?
That's what you need to know the time, and I think.
Well, I sort of already alluded, I guess, a bit to it earlier, which is specificity. I think the biggest trap you can fall into is trying to reach everyone with every message all at the same time. This is possibly the influence of my wife, who's a teacher, but whenever I am creating a product, which could be a video or a book or whatever, I consider learning objectives, what you're actually trying to get your audience to come away with. There's a specific definition of science communication, which I use, which is AEIOU responses, which is awareness, enjoyment, interest, opinion forming, or understanding. And pick one of those, and that's what your principal objective is trying to be. And with relation to your field. And then second to that is the audience question. Who specifically trying to reach, which could be based on age or geography or gender or whatever it is. And then the part I think everybody always forgets about is the format that you are trying to communicate in. So with that audience and that learning objective in mind, what's the best way to reach that audience with that message? Which could be a TikTok, or it could be a book if you want to be really ambitious, or it could be a podcast episode or whatever it is. And I think once you've got your answers to those three questions, it actually kind of writes itself. And the project just naturally forms. But unfortunately, you have to know the answers to those questions first. And sometimes it can be very difficult to work out what you're trying to do. But that's certainly the approach that I have found works across different media. In terms of how to best go about doing it, perhaps this is me speaking because I do this as my job. Go for the way that you're going to enjoy doing. Because if you try to do something that is really ambitious and takes all of your energy, especially if you're a PhD student and you haven't got much time or energy, then you've got to be realistic about what you can accomplish. And the only way that you're going to see something through to the end is if you are really passionate about it. And if it's a message and a method of delivery that you are excited to work on when you get up in the morning. Because then you'll probably finish that project and go, well, I've had another idea for another thing. And then you'll do it again, rather than maybe getting halfway through one project that you thought was optimal and then fell by the wayside and never completed.
I'd just add to that, because I work with colleagues who specialise in knowledge exchange within the university about how to get research messages out, and their first sentence to me almost always is, what's the audience? And they're not just talking about different categories of people within civil society. I mean, it's down to, is this for politicians? If so, which political party? Is this for workers in a particular industry? Is this for business people generally? Is it for people who work in education, other people who work in education? Is it for other researchers? There's a huge number of people, and I think this is probably general to effective dissemination of research. Our instinct as researchers is, well, write an academic paper, because that's where all that's what you get judged on. But even then, which journal should it be in? Should it be in what sort of people are you wanting to read it? So it applies almost everywhere.
One more online.
Yeah.
So someone is asking, how helpful would it be, or will it be, for the government to incentivize green efforts of individuals, and how does that compare to incentivizing green efforts of companies and corporations?
Good question.
I'll come in on that one.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. How helpful it would be to incentivize the green efforts of people? I think very helpful. There is a phrase that's floated around for at least 20 years that refers to some mushy section of the population that we call the able to pay, which basically means the people that government, for some reason, despite all evidence being to the contrary, thinks will go out tomorrow and spend £50,000 retrofitting their houses, as opposed to doing anything else with the £50,000 they might have. Able to pay just means an audience that, for various political reasons, parties of all stripes don't think they should give money to, because it looks regressive. So you've got your lower income households and people who are on benefits. You've got your single mums and your people that you know, some people might call the deserving poor. And then you've got what you might call ordinary people who are getting on fine, who've got some money coming in, notwithstanding the cost of living crisis. And there is no world in which those people are all just going to go out tomorrow, develop a crippling fear about climate change, switch to an EV, buy a cargo bike and insulate their loft with all the money they found down the back of the sofa. It's not going to happen. But actually, a lot of them are, and we saw with the feed-in tariff, people are easily incentivized by reasonably small grants in some cases, and even finances that have to be paid back. So low cost and no cost loans. And the Climate Citizens Project that I'm part of in Lancaster ran for the CCC a deliberative process in Birmingham last year, where we brought together a group of able to pay householders, so owner occupiers in Birmingham, to ask them how the government should design a policy basis for retrofitting the country's homes. And they came up with a beautifully elegant system around a logbook for every house, that if you did the work that was in the logbook, you would get money back off your stamp duty when you bought a new house. You would get these other incentives. The VAT, for example, on the building materials needed would be reduced to zero, which made everything look like it was on sale. You would get an interest-free loan. So they weren't asking for a grant. They just wanted to have the money and pay it back to the government. And, you know, nothing in what they said sounded remotely stupid. And it also doesn't even sound like politically toxic stuff to me. You just ask sensible people and they'll give you a sensible answer, and they'll say, lend me some money and I'll give it you back.
Just one additional point, and from my knowledge of running government grant schemes in the past, there are legal issues. I mean, in principle, sometimes it doesn't really matter whether you subsidise a business or a household. I mean, take an example, say a heat pump. In principle, you could subsidise the manufacturers to make them cheaper, or you could subsidise the users directly, so they pay less. It's been traditionally difficult within European law and still within British law to subsidise individual companies. The notion of state aids, and the state shouldn't be picking individual companies to subsidise. So it generally is easier organisationally and runs less legal problems to subsidise the final purchase, even though sometimes it's probably not as effective, because you can't target it quite as exactly.
Yeah, that's true.
Any other comments on this? Now, we are getting close to our end. I know there are questions out there still. Please come and talk to us afterwards if you've got other questions. I'm sure everyone on the panel will be happy to answer them. But I'm just going to ask my three colleagues on the panel to make just some closing thoughts. And we'll go the opposite order from the way we
Oh, I was
started.
really hoping you wouldn't do that. I think at the heart of everything we've been talking about today it's interesting in that we sort of set it up actually originally of policy, scientists, business to a certain extent, and public. Almost everything we have talked about has actually been public focused. And I think that's because in a weird way, we are all simultaneously the problem, and we are also providing the solutions. And we're providing the solutions in the sense of, as we talked about policy, and these are the things we vote for, and obviously the most important thing you can do is vote. But we are also, as we've heard, the people who are coming up with the sensible solutions if we are only asked to do so. And I think if I'm going to take anything away from the experience of being on this, it's actually affirmed my faith in people to quite a great extent. Not necessarily our ability to actually solve the problem, but certainly the amount of power that we have as individuals has been demonstrated. And I hope that you're going to come away from this with that knowledge that actually, you know, not just as a platitude, you are actually capable of solving this problem as an individual. Thanks. Rachel.
Yeah, so I'm going to go a little bit off piste. It's the elections next Thursday for something like 190. Not in Oxford. But for about 190 places in England, there will be local elections next week, including where I'm currently a councillor. And I'm stepping down because I no longer live in that district. I'm not eligible to run. And I have to say that it has been the most impactful, most empowering experience being a politician, being a local politician and going in, despite all those difficulties of not having you know, the regulations from above, not being able to change the rules, not having the amount of funding. And one of the things that bothers me most about it is that people regularly refer to me as a young politician, and I'm nearly 50. So that just goes to show you how skewed the whole situation is. So I'm going to leave with a plea, really, which is that there are very few young people in politics. And I'm not talking about being an MP, I'm talking about being a councillor, I'm talking about getting involved in politics. And I'm talking about doing it if you come from a science background in particular, because people with science backgrounds are underrepresented in the policy making world, in the political world. And that feeds through to this lack of understanding of the impacts and where things happen. So if you've never really thought about it before, think about it now. Think about putting yourself forward. Of the 590, I think, MPs that we have who have a degree, only 17% of those degrees are STEM subjects. That's way, way less than the national average for people that have a degree. And that all feeds through. And what we need is a new generation of policymakers, and that could be half the people sitting in this room, who are going to go and take their science knowledge and their communications knowledge to take this problem forward. Because it is an extraordinarily impactful thing to do, and I recommend it wholeheartedly to you.
Yeah, nearly 50.
I am.
Sorry.
It's all the politics. Very good for you.
Yeah. There's another reason.
Yeah.
Thank you. This problem that we're talking about, the climate crisis, is very unlike other social, economic problems, because it has a very firm deadline. You know, if we don't solve poverty this year, then we can do it next year, the year after, the year after. You know, if we don't get everyone in this country kind of you know, educated and so on, then you know we can still achieve those targets in future years. But with the climate crisis, we have an actual deadline. We're coming up against the physical limitations of the planet. And that means that we just don't have the luxury of messing about anymore. And we don't have the luxury of going for perfect solutions if an imperfect one is quicker. And we don't have the luxury of sitting around talking about what ifs and what abites and, you know, let's try this, whatever. We need to do everything that we can absolutely now. And we need to stop treating it as if it's just another social or economic problem, because it's not. We do actually have a deadline.
Thank you, and I'll just end by building on both of the last two contributions. I was indeed once a local councillor myself, quite a long time ago. I was obviously very young. But that isn't the only way you can get involved. And I suspect that of the people sitting in this room, many of you will be involved in decisions that are important for climate change over the next 30 years in one way or another. because it is such an issue that transcends so much. There's nothing stopping you now. The university has a sustainability strategy. It wants more people to get involved in delivering that. Most Oxford colleges, for those of you who are in a college, are not doing sufficient. Some are making progress, but a lot are not making sufficient progress. Please get involved. In general, you will find open doors and that people will welcome you to get involved in taking action and helping determine policies. Now, you don't have to wait. With that, I think we'll end, and back to you.
Great. Well, I'd like to say a massive thank you to our panelists. And thank you to everybody here for coming today. Thank you to our online audience. Your questions were great. Only thing I have to say is that there are some refreshments in the lobby. And I think some of our panelists will be sticking around as well. So if you have some burning questions to ask them that you didn't get to ask during the session, then help yourself to some food and drink and feel free to chat to our panelists. So thanks so much, everyone.